up until when they're grown, even older folks. Like, there are people in this world who have no idea what real enthusiastic consent means, and they have assaulted so many people. They've just never been called a rapist for it. They've never been called out for it, and they've never served time for it. And so, I don't know. I'm ranting at this point, all to say that we need to think about, like, the root of issues that are happening every day. And, like, people are in jail because they're addicted to drugs, or because they were selling drugs because they didn't have a job. A lot of times people commit murders in the process of a robbery. They would not have been robbing had it not been for a need that was not met. And this idea was introduced to me by the Black Youth Project 100, BYP 100. They're known as a national organization. When I came back to Chicago, I joined the Black Youth Project. It's a group of young folks ages 18 to 35 who are, like, invested in the freedom of all Black people. So a lot of times when folks are, like, protesting in the streets talking about police brutality, a lot of times the center is, like, Black man, instead of thinking about all these other ways that Black people are impacted by police terrorism, right? But not only talking about issues with policing, but also just talking about other policies that impact trans folks, gender nonconforming folks, differently abled people, all of that stuff, like making sure we have conversations about policies and things that impact them. That is like BYP 100 as a whole. And so I mention them because they're the ones who initially introduced me to prison abolition.
And how did you get involved with BYP 100? Through
a friend who was on the core leadership at BYP 100.
And how can other young professionals get involved in Chicago or elsewhere?
Oh, send an email. Go to our website, byp100.org. And it's not only in Chicago. We have a Durham chapter, New York chapter, Bay Area, folks nationally who are talking about prison abolition and, like, freedom for all Black people.
So we know that being involved in BYP 100, this got you, interested in working around prison abolitionism, and then you started doing some work with the Invisible Institute.
So I was on a panel at the Chicago Urban League on police accountability in 2015. And when I was on that panel, I was the youngest person on the panel, the only woman. And I sat between two people who I now consider colleagues and comrades. Craig Futterman, he's a professor at the law school. He runs the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic. And then Jamie Calvin, who is the investigative journalist who uncovered the Laquan McDonald story. And he is now my executive director. But at the time, I was just a young person who got invited to a panel on police accountability.
He's the executive director of the Invisible Institute?
Jamie Calvin.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. At the time, I was just being myself, being authentically me, but I was working through an AmeriCorps program at the time that I guess Jamie was familiar with.
Shout out to AmeriCorps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we all did AmeriCorps.
Yeah.
It was a good time. And when I was looking for my second year placement for my AmeriCorps program, I ran into Jamie in a stairwell. And I said, "Hey, Jamie, do you remember me?" And he's like, "Oh, yeah, like, I remember you. We Chicago Urban League, you were on the panel with me. You did so great." And I said, like, "Is the Invisible Institute hiring?" And then he ended up hiring me, and then we ended up working with the Invisible Institute ever since. So since 2015, really like 2016, mid-2016, I've been working for the Invisible Institute.
So tell us about the CPDP, how the Invisible Institute is involved with this resource. Give us a quick snapshot.
I don't know how familiar folks are with the history of Chicago, but in the early 2000s, the projects, public housing, was started to be vacated so that they could, like, demolish them. And there's a Black woman, Diane Bond, who was living in the public housing in Stateway Gardens. Jamie, my executive director, a white man who sticks out like a sore thumb in the projects, was there doing work. And so he was familiar with people. Honestly, like, if there's a random white man walking around your neighborhood in Chicago, it's like super segregated. You're gonna be like, "What's up? Who are you?" Da da da. And also, he's just a super friendly guy. Became friends with a bunch of people and was doing some organizing work, supporting folks to get, like, jobs who are living in public housing. Diane was assaulted by a group of 5 officers known as the Skull Cap Crew. They used to come into the public housing and, like, take people's things or like beat them up or sexually assault. She was sexually assaulted. That was one of the things that happened to her. You can read her story in Kicking the Pigeon. You can find it online. It's a piece that Jamie wrote. So she saw Jamie after that happened to her. And she said, like, what do I do? He said, you need to go file a complaint with OPS, the Office of Professional Standards. Some time goes by, the Skull Cap crew was still messing with her, and filing a complaint didn't do anything. So he introduces her to Craig Futterman at the law school, and they end up filing a suit, and she gets a settlement, some like lump sum of money that the city of Chicago pays to, in the similar way the Laquan McDonald's family got money. But in the process of discovery, Craig asked for a list of officers with 10 plus complaints filed against them. And he realized that there was a pattern of people complaining against police officers and like, although so many people were complaining against police officers, the sustain rate was really, really low. So Jamie intervenes as a citizen, and he says like, hey, these documents should be the protection should be lifted from these documents. The public should have information about disciplinary records of the police. And the judge decides, sure. And when Jamie gets a chance to see it, Jamie and the Invisible Institute, which didn't quite exist at the time, there was like 3 people, I think, at the time. They decide that they're going to file a suit, Calvin versus City of Chicago, to get all disciplinary records of police officers, all the way back into the first complaint that was ever filed.
When was that?
1967. And the FOP, Fraternal Order of Police, they have it in the contract that the complaints are supposed to be destroyed either after 5 or 7 years. But the complaints hadn't been destroyed, mostly because of all of the suits that were like all of the legal stuff that was happening around policing, like constantly, right? And so it was a really interesting moment because in the contract, it says we're allowed to have the most recent complaints. So while we were fighting for complaints all the way back to 1967, we had access to complaints between 2011 and 2016. And of those complaints, there were about a little over 28,000 complaints filed against the Chicago Police Department, and only 755 were sustained. So think about that large number, 28,000 complaints filed against police officers, 755 sustained. So when you look at that, like, big picture, you're like, whoa, something's happening. People are filing complaints and they're not being believed. So citizens are not credible in the eyes of this investigative board. But then when you look deeper, you see there's like racial disparity. So a lot of Black people filing complaints, a lot of white people getting sustained complaints against the police.
So what does CPDP stand for?
So it's the Citizens Police Data Project. It is basically this beautiful database that has a heat map of the city of Chicago that shows basically complaints filed against police. And CPDP currently has complaints from 1988 to kind of the present. Yeah. And you can filter through the data by neighborhoods, by districts, by beats. You can see the civilian complaints versus the officer complaints.
I've spent quite a bit of time just like navigating the site. It is
What is the first thing you looked up?
Incredible.
Tell me.
What is the first thing I looked up? I was really interested to dig into individual officers' histories. And by the way, the website it's a database of almost 250,000 allegations, with only 7% of those allegations leading to discipline for police officers in Chicago. That is a staggering number. And that only goes back to, like you said, I think 1988 or something. I don't think I saw anything earlier than that.
Either.
But I was looking at this one officer. He had complaints starting in 1991. I kept looking through CPDP and reading through these individual officer profiles, asking myself, how did some of these officers still have jobs? You can identify officers with dozens of reports of abuse of power or excess use of force, abusive language, racial slurs over the span of 30 years. How do they still have jobs? So what I wanted to ask her, what are the implications of a database like this existing?
So I want to answer the first part, which is how do they still have jobs? And I think that comes down to the credibility of civilians, right? Like, there have been so many cases in this database, you can see the documents and some of the transcribed interviews where the people say, this officer did X, Y, and Z to me. And then the officer, maybe officers who were there, say the opposite, and nothing happened. The allegation is unfounded. On top of that, like, Texas and Illinois are the only two places where you need to sign an affidavit when you're filing a complaint against the police, basically subjecting yourself to perjury. When you sign an affidavit, you're saying, like, what I am saying is 100% true. And the thing is, if you say something and then a police officer says something different, you are then at risk of being charged with perjury because you have signed an affidavit saying something happened that this other person is saying did not happen. And so it really just, like, puts survivors of police violence in a bind when they're trying to file complaints. So a lot of times people don't even sign affidavits. They leave it after that. But also, even then, when they do sign the affidavit, investigators don't believe them. But then even further, so the Invisible Institute is really grounded and rooted in holding public institutions accountable. So data transparency is like numero uno. All of our data, we got that data directly from the city of Chicago. It's online. Like, anybody has access to it. Everyone can see it. People can see our code, everything.
And I assume they were just, ready to hand that over without any kind of struggle, right?
Oh my gosh, it's so difficult to get information in.
We don't need to go through all that.
Right. And so what has happened is that once we launched the site, police officers called us, supervisors, like, saying, like, oh my goodness, I couldn't even see before the list of allegations against the people who I'm supposed to be supervising. That's one thing. Another thing is that civilians, when something happens to them, they are able to look up that officer and see if there's a pattern of folks who have filed complaints against that officer for that same thing, right? And they can build up a profile about this officer, about their previous allegation history, regardless of if it was sustained or not sustained, and say, this thing happened to me, and also these people before me said the same thing. Lawyers use it in that way too. In specific, actually, the Department of Justice, when they were here investigating the patterns and practices of the Chicago Police Department, they used a lot of our data. The data was super accessible for the DOJ to come in and really do some analysis on the patterns and practices of the Chicago Police Department, because we don't only have complaint data in there, we also have use of force data. So whenever a police officer uses force, they're supposed to fill out a tactical response report talking about why they used force, where they were, if the subject was injured or not, if they used their taser, their baton, their chemical weapon, whatever. And so they were able to do analysis on that stuff too, because we had it all already in one place, clean too.
Unfortunately, we do have to move on, but I would encourage anyone who's interested. Actually, you should just go to this website.
cpdp.co.
Ooh, okay. My last thing is we also have, so organizers use it on the front line. You can tweet our Twitter bot, CPDPBOT, a police officer's name, and then it'll tweet you back a link from CPDP.
Wow.
And it'll say like, Officer Stephen Smith has 72 complaints filed against him, has never been disciplined. And then it'll give a link to the officer profile on the site.
That's an incredible tool.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all our listeners for hanging in with us. You're listening to University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. This is Chicagoland. When we come back, some hot takes.
Hey UC3P listeners, I'm Thomas.
And I'm Nick.
In the United States, public faith in the military remains sky high, while trust in other government institutions sinks to an all-time low.
At the same time, fewer than 1% of Americans will ever serve in the armed forces, and the cultural divide between active duty troops and the civilian population continues to widen.
UC3P presents a new series, Thank You for Your Service, where we take a deep dive into the complex world of civil-military affairs.
We'll address the politicization of the military, defense policy in the news, and the importance of staying informed in a democracy.
Join us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts as we explore how our professional military institution relates to the society it serves.
And we're back. All right, Trina, here's the deal. We're going to ask you some questions. This game is called Hot Takes. We haven't told you what the questions are. before this moment, we just want quick responses off the top of your head. It's going to be a speed round. Kyra's going to start us off.
Yeah, we should say these are Chicago hot takes.
Chicago hot takes.
Color is so weird.